Hello everyone, JC here, another Saturday, another Power Automate video. You get to see me with my reading glasses on today. Yes, I am getting old, and thanks for the reminder. So, the most complicated flow that I have is automating our service desk exchange inbox, so someone can send an email there, and rather than a person having to monitor it, this flow is then picking up that message, turning it into a ticket, etc., etc. Part of that is getting an auto response sent to the sender. One thing that this flow does is that it tailors that auto response based on whether or not the email was sent within our business hours, because if it's after business hours, no one's going to look at it. So we let them know, hey, thanks for contacting us. We'll get to you the next business day. So yeah, how do I do that? Well, there are three things that you need to take into consideration when setting business hours, and that's obviously time of day, the day of the week, and holidays or other random days that your business is closed. So let's just hop right in. We're going to do a new instant flow here. So if I initialize a variable, so normally we would get our timestamp from the trigger itself. For demonstration purposes, I'm just going to hard code a value in here, and then that way we can change that as well to simulate different days, different times, etc. So we're just going to throw this value in there, and yes, that is basically the exact value you would get from the timestamp trigger variable. One note here: when you see the Z at the end of a timestamp, that means the offset from UTC is 0. So if you have a 0 offset from Universal Coordinated Time, then this is essentially in UTC. So you would think perhaps that we could just convert our business hours, which we'll say are in Eastern Time, into UTC, and that then you could use those values. You can't do that, and that's because of daylight saving time. Because of daylight saving time, like right now, we just sprung ahead recently, so our offset from UTC is 4 hours. UTC is 4 hours ahead of Eastern Time. However, before we sprung ahead, it was 5 hours ahead of Eastern Time. So if you just converted your business hours into UTC and operated that way, it would be accurate for half of the year, but the other half of the year, your business hours are going to be off by 1. So we can't use that directly. So what we need to do is convert the time that this trigger is fired into our local time, which for demonstration purposes will be Eastern Time. The way that we do that, just do a new action here. There's an action for this, and it is convert time zone. So we are going to convert our trigger timestamp, which is in UTC. So go down our list to 0 and find UTC. And our destination time zone, we are going to state that our business is in the Eastern Time Zone. Now the format string is important. The one that I'm using, and I'm suggesting you use, is the round trip date time pattern. We're going to go with this, and this time format is going to be important later, so we'll be circling back to that. initialize a variable to hold our output there. And since this is converted, we're going to name it, let's do trigger timestamp Eastern. That is going to be a string, and the value is going to be the output of our converted time action. So if we save that and test, show you what that looks like. Alright, so here was our initial value. So you can see UTC 11:55 a.m. When we convert that to Eastern time, we get 7:55 a.m. 4-hour difference. So that is working. So we've got the time in our local time that our trigger has fired. So what we need to know, did this come in on a business day? Not just time, but day. So we're going to extract the day of the week that this trigger fired. And to do that, I'm just going to initialize a variable, a particular name, and we're going to hold that value. Now, in order to find this out, we're going to use an expression. And we're going to use the day of week function. And we just do our trigger timestamp Eastern. And then I do want to show you this just because if you've not used a day of week function before, the output might be surprising. Alright, so 6 means last day of the week, Saturday. If it were Sunday, that would be a 0, and then the other ones are self-explanatory. So that's what we'll be comparing on later. Now that we've got the time our trigger came in and the day our trigger came in, our flow needs to know what our business hours actually are. So we're going to have to create a couple of variables for that. And we're going to do business hours start Eastern. This is a little more complicated than you might think. We're actually going to build this string on the fly out of our other variables. So this variable, business hours start, is going to represent on the day that this flow fired, what were the business hours. So we build it dynamically. So we're going to use an expression to do that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the day from our trigger timestamp Eastern, so whatever today is. So to get that, remember this is the format that the time is in. So we need the first 10 characters. Now we'll be pulling it from this variable, but for demonstration purposes, we're pulling the first 10 characters off of whatever our timestamp value is, because that represents the current day. So in order to do that, we're going to use the substring function, and it's going to be a substring of our trigger timestamp Eastern variable, and we're going to take the first through the 10th characters. Now we need to combine that date with whatever our start of business hour is. So to do that, we're going to use the concat function, and we're going to combine the date that we just pulled there with t, and I'm going to say my business opens at 8 o'clock. So if you go back up to our timestamp, you see you have your date, then a T, and then the time. So we're doing the same thing. We pulled off the date, and then we're going to manually enter the time of 8 o'clock. You don't need anything after the seconds. You probably don't even need the seconds. So if I save that, what did I do? Oh, well, yeah, if you spell a variable wrong, that's going to happen. Eastern. Update. Test. Save. Okay, so the output of that concat and substring operation is the date that the flow came in on, the date that the trigger fired, T 0800. That's in Eastern time. Now we're going to do the same thing with business hours end. So new variable. And again, doing an expression. And we're going to do concat, substring, variables, trigger, timestamp, Eastern, the first 10, and then we're going to do T, and let's say I close at 5, so it's 1700, there's no colon there. And, oh man, spelled it wrong again. Save. Okay, so it thinks it's okay. So now we're actually ready to compare the time that the trigger was fired to our business hours. And that's, there are a couple of components there. So what I'm going to do is create yet another variable. And this one is going to be within business hours. And we're going to leave it boolean. We'll set it to false by default. Actually, no, we won't. It will not be false by default. We're going to use an expression to determine if trigger timestamp Eastern falls within our business hours and our business days. So just to make this a little easier to see, because this has no multi-line view. So I've got Visual Studio Code here, and I'll show you the expression that we're going to use. So for the purposes of my example, our business days are Monday through Friday, so we would be excluding Sunday and Saturday. So this expression has a few pieces, but basically it's saying all these things in here must be true. So the way to read this is trigger timestamp Eastern day of week is not equal to Sunday, and trigger timestamp Eastern day of week is not equal to Saturday. That and trigger timestamp Eastern is greater than or equal to business hours start Eastern, and trigger timestamp Eastern is less than business hours end. So it didn't come in on the weekend, and it came in within our business hours. That's what this expression is doing. So we put that into our expression, click OK, click Save, hope for no errors. There are no errors. Awesome. So that gets us that. Now, for my purposes, I also wanted holidays in there. So in order to do that, we're going to we have to figure out some way of enumerating when those holidays are. So I'm going to use the compose action and create essentially a list of holidays. So we'll just keep this simple and just put 2 in here. So perhaps everyone gets off Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And then we're going to create a new Boolean variable named on holiday. This one we will initialize to false. Then we're going to do an apply to each. And we're going to select the output of our compose, which is named outputs. And we're going to add a condition. And the condition that we want, so what we want to do is for each holiday entry, we want to know if the day that our trigger fired matches. So we need to compare the date of the trigger timestamp Eastern. So we're going to use the substring function to get that out of there. And again, that's the first 10 characters. So are the first 10 characters of our timestamp equal to, and that's going to be the current item. So the current item being pulled from here. And then if it is equal to that, then we know it is a holiday. So then we're going to do set variable, and we're going to pick on holiday, and we're going to change that to true. And this is unnecessary, but just for demonstration purposes, I will do the same thing over here, and we'll set on holiday to false. This is worthless because it's already false. We initialized it that way, but we'll do that anyway. Save it. Now, remember, this is hard-coded in here. So this is a Saturday and not a holiday. So we are expecting to get within business hours to be false because it's on weekend and we're not open on weekends. And we're expecting on holiday to be false because it's not Christmas Eve or Christmas. So let's test it. Alright, so within business hours, false. So that worked properly. And let's see what the final value of on holiday ended up being. So the first trip through, it was false. Second trip through, it was false. That's what we expect. So now we really need to test that again with a different value. So that's why I manually set this variable, is we can come in here and change it. So if we change this to April 14th, which is not a weekend, test that, run it, done. So now we are expecting, oh, sorry, within business hours, April 14th is a weekday, is it not? It is. Oh, okay. So it worked because 7:55 a.m. is outside of our business hours of 8. So that once again worked. So that was a good test. So now if we change this to 12, so we'll be coming in at 8:55 Eastern time. Now within business hours should be true, and it is. So that's calculating properly. Now if we come in here and add April 14th as a holiday, on holiday should now be true. Oh, well, it starts off as false. After it goes through our apply to each, it should be true on the third iteration, and it is. So on holiday is now set to true. So that's how you check for business hours. You could, if you didn't want to do something different with your flow, if it's on a holiday as opposed to just outside business hours, you could combine, these into one variable. Like after you've figured out that it's on a holiday, you could create another Boolean variable that if either one of those evaluates to true, then outside business hours evaluates to true. But in my instance, I wanted different behavior if it was outside of our standard business hours as opposed to on a holiday. But with this scaffolding, you've got everything that you need to then have your flow react appropriately. I know it seems like a lot, but once you've done this, you can, this is fairly easily copied to another flow. So you build it once, reuse it, and it should work well for you. If there are any questions, post them in the comments. And again, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you found it useful. And until next time, farewell.